Andreas Malm works in the Department of Human Geography at Lund University. He's a scholar of human ecology and environmental history and has written a bunch of terrific books. The Progress of This Storm, Nature and Society in a Warming World, Fossil Capital, The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and most recently, White Skin, Black Fuel, on the Danger of Fossil Fascism, which he co-authored with the Zetkin Collective. In our interview, Malm addresses some of his claims about the use of political counterviolence and the ability of social movements to regulate it. Malm is making the case for thinking more deeply about the almost inevitable radicalization of generations of young people that are waking up in a world that has been basically abandoned to the interests of fossil capital. The intergenerational violence of climate inaction should translate into anger, one emotion that we know is conducive to mobilization. But what kind of mobilization? What kind of anger? And what place does hope have in this political dynamic? Given that the globe's richest 1% bears the greatest responsibility for the climate crisis, it makes sense, Malm suggests, to guide anger in the political direction of undoing the extraction and extortion, the violence created through fossil capitalism as a system that benefits its biggest boosters, while condemning the rest of us to what he calls the death machine of global heating. It's still politically imperative, Malm says here, for social movements to make a case through communication and the intentional pursuit of publicity for their radical objectives, but this must be coupled with confrontation. And in this moment of impasse, when persuasion mostly hasn't worked, where it's clear that we need political dynamics that include a state that's willing to accept the realities implied by a socially just energy transition, Malm's research is remarkable for its interdisciplinarity, its militancy, and the forthrightness of his writing. We're at a moment, of course, now, especially where you've got like the UN Environment Program issuing a report called Making Peace with Nature, using that kind of language of like armistice, where they're attempting to address the extent to which humanity is literally, quote, waging war on nature. You know, in the words of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, you know, it's about identifying the accelerating erosion of life itself on Earth. I just recently attended a talk by Kara Daggett, who's also been on this podcast, and I asked her about a certain anti-capitalist tolerance for violence, and specifically your sense of the kind of need for a radical flank of climate militancy in order to kind of get through this time of impasse and intractability. What I'm interested in is the sort of ambivalence to some extent in your work about what you call the art of political violence. You see it as a calculation and a kind of secondary supplementary strategy for advancing this struggle against a seemingly invincible evil.
Yeah.
So like, I've really, as I say, found your work illuminating, and especially like alongside my reading of The Force of Nonviolence by Judith Butler. You know, Butler talks about the need to storm fences, but she's also adamant that violence is a force that's always on the verge of getting out of hand, of spiraling kind of out of control. I wondered if you could speak to this essay that you recently wrote for Verso's website, basically, where you're responding to a number of different critiques of your book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. In that essay, you talk about how there are plenty of cases in history that show violence is, in fact, not impossible to control, right? It's not spinning automatically into bloody vendettas. Can you speak to that specific idea that, you know, violence is not necessarily something that is impossible to control, and how this narrative of nonviolence kind of stands outside of history?
Well, yeah. First of all, Scott, it's an honor to be with you, and thanks so much for the generous and kind words on the book. I must admit that I haven't read Judith Butler's The Force of Nonviolence, except for a chapter, I think, on the death drive that is included in that book.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't really comment on her take on those issues. But the idea that violence, as soon as you start engaging in a kind of violence, and this would presumably include property destruction, when it's out there, it's just uncontainable, and it will automatically bring on a spiral of violence.
Mm.
I'm not denying that that risk exists, obviously, but for the kind of uh, uh, political violence um, used by certain social movements, I don't think it's entirely correct, because movements can set up limits to the kind of violence that they deploy, and keep those limits in place. And the example that I draw on in that text that you referred to is the George Floyd uprising in the U.S. last year, which included quite a lot of counter-violence from protesters, mostly in the form of property destruction. But since police often tend to protect the property that you want to destroy, this also included certain kinds of militant engagement with the police, as in throwing projectiles of various kinds against the police, such as when people stormed the police station in the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis 3 days after the murder of Floyd. And that was a violence, a kind of violence that did not target human beings. It was not the goal of that violence to kill police officers. And this was, I'm not sure that this was actually a matter of much internal debate in the movement. I think it developed almost organically, and a kind of collective self-discipline emerged in the movement that inhibited people who might have had any ideas of arming themselves and going up to cops and assassinating them, or I don't know, sending suicide bombers into police headquarters or something like that, and prevented them from doing so, because there was, I think, a general understanding of the movement that some kinds of violence we can engage in, and even win popular support for. And notably, there was that poll that showed that a majority of Americans actually supported storming that police station. But other kinds of violence would burn away our popular support. So, and it's not that it was technically impossible to engage in those forms of violence, because I mean, obviously there are quite a few guns around in the U.S., so you could potentially pick up guns and go out and assassinate cops. No one did that, despite something like 20 or 30 or 25 or even 30 million people demonstrating after the murder of George Floyd. So you would imagine that some people would have entertained those ideas, but no one did that for a very good reason, and that would have been a step too far.
Mhm.
And that just shows that even in this moment of in this case nationwide rage over the violence perpetrated against African Americans, did not translate into uncontrollable counterviolence. And you have I mean, there are a lot of other cases of political movements that deliberately engage in certain form of violence, but decide that no, we're not going to engage in other forms of violence. So I'll take two very, very different examples just to support this thesis. One is anti-fascist action, famously known as Antifa in the U.S. discourse. Anti-fascist action in my country, Sweden, has long been engaging in militant resistance against organized fascists and Nazis. So that means using certain types of violence in confrontation with those Nazis. But anti-fascist action in Sweden decided, and this of course applies to all other countries as well, decided very early on that we're never going to kill a Nazi. And no matter how many anti-fascists and people of color that have been killed by Nazis in Sweden over the past 30 years, I believe it's about 20 people or something like that have been killed by Nazis. And no matter all the intense confrontations and looming vendettas between Nazi activists and anti-fascists, or rather, the anti-fascist action organization, I'm not an active member any longer, has never transgressed and crossed that line into actually killing a Nazi, because it has stayed to the committed to the principle that that would massively harm the cause, and killing someone is prima facie a bad thing to do. So all other things considered, when you start looking at it, it's a bad thing to do. It can be justified in very particular circumstances, but if the effects of killing someone is to do further damage to the cause that you're struggling for, then the principal ban on killing is just reinforced.
Hmm.
And a completely different case in an entirely different setting is the organization of Hamas, that has engaged in quite extreme political violence, including suicide bombings. But Hamas made a decision early on, unlike other factions in the Palestinian resistance movement, to never engage in political violence outside of the land of Palestine. So you had the PFLP doing hijackings and various types of very violent actions all over the world. Hamas has never done that. And that shows that even if you're engaging in the most extreme types of political violence, in this case suicide bombings, you can still, if you are an organization with discipline, maintain principles. And again, this is not because Hamas didn't have supporters or the logistical capacities to engage in those kind of actions in other parts of the world. It's just that it made a decision that it's more strategic for us to stay inside the land of Palestine. This is not to say that I support Hamas terrorism. It's just one more case to try to bring home my interpretation of these things, that to an extent that is often underestimated, the calibration of political violence is in fact a product of decisions at the hands of the social movements that engage with it.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. This idea of different intensities of violence that are responses to, violence, of course, being done to you, like a structural violence that is a condition of everyday life. I mean, it's something that for many of us in the West is sort of unimaginable. I mean, this is another main thread in how to blow up a pipeline. This idea of like individualism and self-preservation, and that these are kind of in the West, especially, like very powerful impediments to a form of resistance that could lead us into a politics of, mass self-preservation. And I'm thinking especially here through Angela Davis's point in an interview with Astor Taylor, that neoliberalism imposes certain like restrictive temporalities that limit our scope to just our individual lifespan, our own self-interest. I definitely want to come back to the question of sort of strategic pacifism and the calibration of violence in particular movements. But in terms of your writing on the climate crisis specifically, you don't necessarily talk that much about an intergenerational responsibility or these restrictive temporalities. Could you maybe speak to that at all? Is that one of the ways in which our thinking is limited?
It's a very good question, the intergenerational thing, because one of the outstanding aspects of the wave of climate activism that we saw in 2019, and that really, at least in Europe, carried the movement to a scale that it had never approached before, was that it was not based on class, it was not based on race, it was not based on gender, it was based on age. It was fundamentally a youth movement that spun out of Greta Thunberg and other school children striking in protest against what they perceived as the destruction of their future. And age is not a category that Marxist analysis, for one, has, to my knowledge, ever engaged with seriously.
Hmm.
But in the climate philosophy and climate ethics, intergenerational aspects are absolutely central to the problem, because of this temporality that so fundamentally constitutes the climate problem, means that every generation that engages in large scale fossil fuel combustion uh, essentially destroys some of the life conditions of the following generation. And the youth movement in 2019 was, it appears, based on a kind of intuitive insight into that intergenerational violence, if you like, with those kids going out on the streets in the knowledge that their future is being ruined, and that they will suffer the consequences of what people have done before they were even born. And obviously, the intergenerational injustice is not the only one that constitutes the climate crisis and all the violence and injustice being perpetrated within it. There is also the crucial distinction between rich and poor, and between humans and other species. But given the salience of age in the movement in 2019, I think it's something that needs to be theorized, by scholars who work on climate more fundamentally than what we've seen so far. I'm not entirely up to date, I should say, with what's been written here, because I've seen at least one paper about children as a kind of new inhabiting a new position of climate precarity or something like that. So I guess there is work out there that is being done. That it's just that I haven't read it and haven't followed it as much as I should. But I do think that this is something that needs to be grappled with and thought about also, precisely because if there is any group that is going to engage in a kind of escalation of tactics, it will be primarily young people, and young people around the world will have to deal with the consequences that are almost literally in the pipeline. And if there's going to be any kind of radicalization, it's going to be based on that age cohort, if you like.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I think when you ask at the end of your book, does this climate movement possess a radical flank? You're thinking through the symbolic effect of Greta Thunberg's activism, right? Like, it's this idea of an intergenerational radicalization due to climate precarity. But yeah, I kind of wanted to stay with this question of violence and strategic pacifism. Like you note throughout How to Blow Up a Pipeline that nonviolence, quote, confers upon the movement a bundle of well-known tactical advantages. And you've kind of already addressed some of those. The history that you provide, this kind of genealogy of violence and nonviolence in these movements, is about trying to expose this as something that is a very selective history. My question, I guess, is like, is the argument then for strategic pacifism always just about courting public opinion? Where does the rejection of potentially necessary acts of forceful resistance come from? And in particular, why might it be that, in the US and elsewhere, there seems to be this curious inverse relationship between the everyday level of violence in a space, the kind of background banality of violence, and the public's tolerance for acts of violent resistance?
Yeah, I mean that inverse relationship, I think is quite strong, and I think I mean, not intuitively perhaps, but logically it makes sense that the more overwhelming the violence of the dominant structure is, the more unacceptable is the idea that any kind of counterviolence from below. Yeah, I mean, the less acceptance there will be for that sort of counterviolence. Now, but I'm afraid that the argument in How to Blow Up a Pipeline around those things has already become a little bit obsolete, because the contrast between the US and France that I draw on there too. So the argument is that in France there is a much greater tolerance for things like fighting with cops or smashing windows and destroying property, because there is a popular revolutionary culture that is still glowing, and sometimes the embers are shooting up, or quite regularly in fact, in various types of revolts in the country. Whereas in the US, the argument is in the book, the power of capital is so unlimited, and it's based on a history of so much violence against the indigenous populations in the US, and the African Americans that were enslaved, and the result of this yeah, suffocation or saturation of capitalist violence is that you cannot countenance any kind of resistance that goes beyond meek pacifism. But that diagnosis was, in a sense, overhauled by the Floyd episode, because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these things are not set in stone. They can shift quite dramatically, and I think one expression of the radicalization of segments of the American population was precisely the approval of property destruction in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. That I think, I mean, the parameters of political opposition shifted during those months, and of course that's a process that has been unfolding in the U.S. for some time, with all the deep and structural divisions of that country coming to the surface in various forms. Um, I mean, I think these changes these things can change quite rapidly, and if you think about this in terms of climate politics, I think very serious climate disasters that kill quite a lot of people than what we've seen so far will also change people's perceptions of what is violence, what is lethal to people, how they can be killed, and what is legitimate to do in response to that. So, given precisely this temporality of the climate crisis, I think certain forms of radicalization are almost inevitable. And if they are not, all we can expect is for humanity to resign itself to the death machine that is global heating, and that's not uh, an alternative that we should bank on. I think. I mean, if there is a survival instinct still in operation in the human species, you would expect some fight back to occur sooner or later. And maybe the question is not whether there should be violence or not, but rather when the violence starts on the climate front, how do we contain it and give it political direction and impose essential limitations on it, so precisely to avoid any kind of spiraling or indiscriminate violence.
Yeah, that's so interesting. In your book, you're outlining this timeline in which things can shift, as you say, where, as you write, the mass mobilizations of the third cycle of climate activism become impossible to ignore, where, hypothetically peaceful protests and effective communication somehow works to kind of seize a shift in public consciousness, and then parliamentary politics makes it possible to push an environmental audit and restructuring into place. But your sense clearly is that the ruling classes are not going to be talked into action. You give the reader a set of really difficult options: learn to die, accepting that a kind of climate fatalism, to use your term, or enter a new phase of resistance beyond peaceful protest. The problem is that fossil fuels really do represent a material form of contemporary capitalism, and property is still this unassailable idea. And so in your argument, and I think this is something you've reinforced a number of times in a bunch of interviews, is that destruction can't be random, right? It's all about this kind of tactical kind of routing of this anger into something productive. And I guess I wonder here about the role of persuasion, like in the sense that targeted, timely destruction could theoretically be prefaced or framed by the work that you do, for example, like a tactic of articulating a sympathetic antagonism. I mean, you seem to be suggesting this when you write that we, quote, should posit a law of a tendency of the receptivity to rise in a rapidly warming world, rather than presuming the species-wide death wish. Is there still some role, as it were, for forms of advocacy journalism, theorization?
Yes. I think that if climate activists at some point start engaging in property destruction on more than a micro scale, that's all what we've had so far. That kind of property destruction needs to come along with texts that explain what we or they are doing and why, and make the case for the legitimacy of that action that just happens without any kind of communique or publicity material that justifies it, is far less successful, is far less likely to be successful when it comes to gaining mass support and using that action to further the political dynamic that you want to see. So I think that activists contemplating this kind of tactics should really make a serious effort to to read and think and write and make arguments for doing what they might be doing. I don't see any other way to sort of reach out to masses not involved in the specific action, and to uh, connect such an action to what's going on in a larger movement. And let me just also say that property destruction can come in many different forms. It can be done by small groups of people who plan it in advance, or it can be done by masses of people in the heat of the moment. So, for instance, with that case of the storming of the police station in Minneapolis, that wasn't something that a little small group of people had planned before. It developed out of the confrontation between very angry demonstrators and the cops around that building. While on the other hand, in the BLM movement last year, you saw people going up to statues of, Confederate generals or slave traders in the US and the UK and tearing them down with various tools that they had brought with them. And that clearly was another kind of property destruction. It was premeditated and was planned by small groups. And I think in the climate struggle, you could see both and and many other kinds of property destruction, as in small groups of people going to take down sources of fossil fuel combustion and explaining why they're doing that. Actually, it's happening right now with Extinction Rebellion diversifying in the UK into escalated forms of tactics. So some of XR's activists are having a campaign to systematically smash windows at some of the mega banks pouring trillions of dollars into fossil fuel extraction. So they go up to the banks of Barclays or HSBC or those banks and smash the windows, and they of course explain to people why they're doing this. And I think that's the right way to go about it when you do that kind of property destruction. But I think the more spontaneous mass-based property destruction, of course, also need to be put into a kind of discursive context where you have a movement explaining why this is happening. And that can be, that can be done on Twitter, or it can be done with books, or anything in between. But surely it needs to be done.
And it kind of leads into a question I had around this work that I've been reading on sabotage in particular, and these concepts in your, like, I've been trying to kind of build out from the concepts in your book around intelligent sabotage, what you call the know-how of grand property destruction. One of the influential texts seems to be Evan Calder Williams' Manual Override, which argues specifically for this need for expertise in enacting sabotage, expertise that's built into the system of capitalism. And I actually encountered Williams' ideas through this essay by Darren Barney called Beyond Carbon Democracy, which develops this idea of what he calls the sabotorial subject, which he, really sees, because, you're talking about how publicity is still part of the overall game plan, right? It's not an either or thing. He's a little bit more prescriptive in this article, and he's like really deeply indebted to Williams on the point that climate activism should try to move beyond privileging speeches, texts, high-profile events that are designed to gain publicity. He talks about how sabotage instead is a mode of action strategically addressed to mobility rather than to publicity. And you've written extensively about how fossil capital is about the movement of objects, goods, people, the search for cheap labor. I think he's thinking through that as well. Like, he's trying to imagine a form of resistance that is, as he puts it, non-discursive, that isn't concerned with persuasion. It's about just setting a struggle in motion. Instead, he says there's no need to promote sabotage because sabotage is already underway. Does he have a point from your perspective about, moving away from a gestural politics and into a phase of direct action or sabotage? Or is this like deployment of a generalized dismantling of fossil fuel infrastructure in some way playing it safe? Like, is it too theoretical in a certain way?
Well, on the question of whether actions speak for themselves and can, if that's the argument that he makes, to a degree, I'm in sympathy with that, and I'm in sympathy with the position that we need to switch from just producing one article after another and one one library of books after another about how bad the climate crisis is to engaging in some kind of action of corresponding magnitude. I'm in total sympathy with that, but my own how should I put it? My own ideals about how a well executed action appears is that it is part of a much broader kind of ongoing unrest, and for that to work out, there needs to be some kind of words attached to the action. Perhaps not necessarily, but that's just, I mean, that's how I have seen those things. I mean, when I was at my most activist as a teenager in this country back in the 90s, we always did direct actions, but we always made sure to attach some kind of communique or explanation to it, to try to explain to people what we were doing, and seeing that as the only way to get the support that we wanted, and to have a productive dialectic in relation to other kinds of activism. And the idea that you can have a worldwide direct action campaign demobilizing the fossil fuel infrastructure without the need for political mediation. I mean, we're talking about the largest technical infrastructure on the planet, basically. And the idea that people could rise up and just take it down by themselves, all of it, isn't plausible to me. I mean, how would something like that play out in a country like Saudi Arabia, which is obviously totally central to the fossil economy, or even Russia? I don't see the transition unfolding without a political dynamic that includes states and legislation and agreements of various kinds. It's just that states will never do what's necessary without mass pressure, and that mass pressure apparently needs to be heightened, and potentially include more radical types of action than what we've seen so far. So my argument has never been that we can bring down the entire fossil fuel infrastructure by means of sabotage. It's just that I think that we in the climate movement need to experiment with more types of tactics than what we've had so far, to make the enemy feel the heat, really, and start to instigate the processes that are necessary to get out of fossil fuels. But these processes will have to include very different agents than activists. I mean, they will have to include states. I'm convinced.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's something that, again, adds a certain clarity to your writing. It's maybe fashionable to be just, against any notion of the state or sovereignty. Your idea is that, I think writing can serve a different kind of function to open up ways of imagining a way of being anti-capitalist, not, as you say, in another world, but in this world. I was, just generally struck by the extent of your research, the work that you do in Corona climate chronic emergency around, how bats act as reservoirs for so many viruses. There was so much in that section of the book that I just didn't know and hadn't read anywhere else. I wanted to ask, I guess, in terms of methodology, how you do go about doing your research. Could you speak to just how you approach writing in terms of that, transition from cobbling together research to, actually making an intervention?
Well, I mean, so the Corona book that I wrote, which was really an exercise in speed writing, and it therefore has some serious flaws, particularly towards the end. That book and this pipeline book are brief interventions into political situations or conjuncture. And yeah, the Corona book was based on me sitting locked up in the apartment where we were living in Neukölln, just swallowing one peer-reviewed scientific paper on zoonotic spillover after another, and then trying my best to sum up what other people have found, because I've never done any primary research about zoonotic spillover or anything related to that. My own research, let me engage in a little bit of shameless self-promotion here, because the research I've done in recent years has been mostly about the far right.
Hmm.
And the Zetkin Collective, which I'm part of, is now finally releasing, or Verso is releasing, the book that we've been working on for, what is it now, 3 years.
A massive tome, right?
Yeah, White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism. It's more of a tome, yes, than those brief interventions. It's nearly 600 pages, and that's been an exercise in collective research where we 20 people have worked together, looking at what the far right has said and done about climate and energy in certain European countries and the US and Brazil, and using different methodologies. So it's quite a lot of methodological anarchy in that book,
Hmm.
because there are so many people involved in the project, and some of them, for instance, Irma Allen, our collective member who's been working on Polish coal miners and their relation to right-wing populism. She's done the kind of classical ethnographic anthropology work, staying with those miners, living with them for a year, being inside the mines and talk to them and all that. So in her research on Poland, she's drawn obviously on that kind of methods. Others of us we've essentially just collected material from media of what those parties have done. So yeah, it's a bit of an anarchy there. Right now, I'm doing more classical environmental history research. Sitting in archives and stuff like that, which I, as a real history nerd, enjoy immensely.
Hmm.
But one of the liberties that I have in my job as a lecturer in or what am I now, associate professor in human ecology, is that this discipline is so free and transdisciplinary in its self-identification that you can do almost whatever you want. You can switch from eco-criticism to to contemporary environmental politics, to environmental history, and almost anything. And that's a kind of freedom that I think is a privilege, and it allows for this kind of jumping between different styles of writing and different kinds of research, and that of course is problematic because you dabble in different fields, or I dabble in different fields, but it has a sense of freedom to it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there'd be almost a kind of nerve-wracking quality to that freedom for a lot of scholars who still, operate within certain kind of disciplinary boundaries, and really have, I think, a very concrete idea of who their audience is. Like, when White Skin Black Fuel comes out, it's going to just, I mean, it's going to attract, I think, an incredibly wide array of people. But I kind of wanted to maybe return to, as it were, like the limits and possibilities of like publicity, publishing and performance. And I wondered if we could talk about the power and importance of like tone in public communication. You note, for example, a shift in Greta Thunberg's, style of communication, especially when she addressed the UN, and announced, "We will not forgive you." There was a shift in that moment toward a certain kind of anger in 2019. There's this idea in your Verso piece that you just published of learning to articulate rage, to stop being so timid. I'm specifically thinking of a talk you gave, which begins with this diatribe against Trump's xenophobic travel ban against Muslim countries. And I guess I wanted to ask, like, is that performance of anger ever calculated or planned, or is it always spontaneous? Like, and you know what I mean? Because like it's somewhat unacademic.
Yes, yes.
And I wonder to what extent it's a self-aware and strategic thing as an activist and an academic to use communication to try and gain some kind of traction that, just being a lecturer isn't necessarily going to give you.
Well, I mean, uh, people who know me closely as a person, but this is perhaps beside the point. But they would say that I'm. It's not very hard for me to express anger,
Right.
at least about political things. I don't think I'm my political temperament, if you like, has, I guess, well, largely been inflected through anger, because uh, when I became politically active in the 1990s in the struggle against racism, the far right in Sweden, and then the Palestine solidarity movement, uh, I was upset about things, and that is a mode I lapse into quite easily. So it's not calculated in the sense that I've been sitting in my chair and thought about what emotion should I convey, what's most effective. Well, anger seems like the best one, so let's go for that. It comes a little bit more spontaneously than that, I think. But I do think a case can be made for the importance of anger. There is this research in climate psychology about, should we scare people or should we give them hope? What's the kind of emotional state that's most conducive to action? Is it alarm? Is it anxiety? Is it optimism? And as far as I've read up on this field, and again, I'm sure you can find gaps in my knowledge here, but they will certainly be many. But my impression is that the research indicates that the one emotion that really drives social movement mobilization tends to be anger. This is obviously what we saw after the murder of George Floyd last year, and innumerable other examples. And the climate movement is getting there, but it still has a way to go to learn to articulate all the anger that we should feel about the systematic destruction of the climate, done by fossil fuel companies above anyone else. And that anger should be expressed by activists, but also by scholars who think that it's important to try to stop and reverse climate catastrophe. It's a very legitimate emotional response to what's happening in the world. I mean, just take a report such as the one put out by Oxfam and Stockholm Environment Institute about half a year ago, that says that the richest 1% of humanity has emitted twice as much CO2 as the poorest half of humanity since the 1990s. This being computed on the basis of consumption. And you can have quarrels about that, but clearly the ultra-rich are responsible for a systematic destruction of this planet in their role as consumers, but perhaps even more in their role as investors and owners of capital. And these figures are in themselves mind-boggling and dizzying, and should make people extremely angry,
Hmm.
as should continued fossil fuel extraction. For instance, Total, the single largest private company in France, planning to go deeper into the Arctic to drill for even more fossil gas. I mean, what other reaction than anger could that induce? Well, it could, of course, induce total despair and passivity, but these are precisely the feelings that are not conducive to action. They're conducive to desisting from action.
Hmm.
So the one action that can the one feeling that can prompt people to do something in these contexts is, as far as I can tell, anger. And then, if so, then that's something that we should learn to express.
Yeah, and you're certainly adamant that there's something potentially demoralizing about the ultra rich existing within this kind of, the space outside of the social, right? The space of permanent escape.
Yeah.
And you say, like, a climate movement that does not want to eat the rich will never hit home. So, like, that's working to me beyond notions of political will or of social license, these terms that we sometimes get around fossil fuel extraction.
Mm.
And you're drawing this, like, firm distinction between the interests of the ruling class and the working class. And so many, yeah, moments in the book made me angry. I mean, the idea that 56 countries in the world have an annual per capita emissions lower than the emissions from one individual flying once between London and New York. So you have that on the one hand, but then you have, as you say, the kind of demoralizing effects of seeing a super yacht or confronting the sheer ubiquity of these gas guzzling SUVs.
Mm.
I think what I'd like to ask you about is, I haven't asked enough, perhaps, about your book, Corona, Climate, Chronic Emergency, which you say you kind of sped through the writing of. There's significant parts of that book that are devoted to distinguishing between the pandemic and the climate crisis. And I think you do this work of, debunking certain knee-jerk assumptions about the major points of divergence. So COVID is more visible. The state knows how to attack it. Moreover, like, the solutions are clear. The path to a kind of warlike triumph is imaginable. And your point is that the solution is actually quite simple when it comes to the climate crisis: stop the emissions.
Yeah.
and I wanted to maybe link this to your engagement with the situation in India. You say, in both the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, hopelessness is not a natural state. It's compounded by inaction.
Yeah.
If you don't have a state that's capable of action, that is unwilling to take action, it breeds a certain hopelessness. We're seeing that in India right now. The inability in specific places to actually, target problems at their roots. Like, what would it look like, I guess, to have a public that was sort of radicalized and mobilized by, problems of just like the structure itself, acceleration itself, the age of fossil capital.
Mm.
Can we imagine that level of comprehensive politics in the current moment?
Well, yeah, it would need a massive breakthrough out of this self-reinforcing spiral of paralysis that you described so eloquently, because it really is. I mean, the less that is being done to mitigate the climate crisis, the less people will think can be done, and so on and so forth. And to reverse that, you need quite a significant shift in the direction of the spiral. And you would have you would need to produce a recursive cycle of people thinking, well, look, we can actually take apart some of this infrastructure to this, drawing in more people and having political initiatives that work in the same direction and so on. I mean, I don't think that such a shift is impossible. I think it's hard to predict how it could come about. Something like Joe Biden's recent announcement that US emissions will be slashed by half to 2030. I mean, it's obviously insufficient, as many point out, but it's also an incredibly dramatic break with the position of Biden's predecessor in the White House. And if anything like that would get underway, you would have rising expectations. I think that's what we saw during the Obama period, with as woefully inadequate as Obama's climate policy was, and as bad as his de facto promotion of fossil fuel production in the U.S. was, even his ideology production, his talk about the climate crisis being real, served to raise people's expectations and translate into more climate activism towards particularly the end of his second term. And as limited as it will be, the kind of climate reformism that someone like Joe Biden could possibly launch might help to or contribute to a kind of a wider process that includes much more radical types of action as well. I don't think that, I mean, the sort of mystery that we see playing out in India right now is perhaps the most likely scenario for climate as well, where one disaster is just compounded by another, and you have general gloom and despair. But the anger should kick in sooner or later, and it in the best cases it kicks in, and it does so conjointly with some kind of political movement, some kind of motion in policy making, or whatever you want to call it, the more official institutional political sphere, that can start to turn the tables and see things moving in the other direction. But we'll see. All of these things, of course, are up to what people actually do. It's not predetermined. It's not modeled. It's a function of what people think and do, and the kind of history that they make. Obviously, under circumstances not of their own choosing, but still, people can make history and try to intervene in it and shift it in other directions. That's what we have to believe. Otherwise, we can just lay down and learn to die.
Right. This climate fatalism that you talk about, and use this phrase. Every revolt has been discouraged by the elders of defeatism. You're saying that even and especially when things are so dire, when things are so miserable, like that's the moment where it doesn't become like more outlandish to imagine a way out. It becomes more necessary.
Yeah.
You say like revolt and revenge are not really negated by the fact that we're on the cusp of unimaginable damage. Saying it's too late is consigning people to die. it can't be an option. You say we have to reprogram ethical codes to kind of match that. Yeah, so I really appreciate your writing.